How's it guys? So today we're going to be doing a multiplication of brackets and then a simplification of expressions. So in grade 8 you would have been doing things like this. So you'd have a bracket with a single term and they'd ask you to square it. Now because we've only got a single term inside of our bracket, we then were taught that this square sign applies to both my coefficient and my variable. So what would happen is we'd be squaring our 4, which would give us 16, and then we'd square our variable, which has already been squared. Now, going back to rules in grade 8, we know that if we have a power raised to another power, we're going to just multiply our exponents out and the answer would be x to the power of 4. That is of course seen because a bracket squared means x squared times x squared. And when we have the multiplication of variables which are the same, we have to add our exponents. The answer to that, again, just to prove to you, would be x to the power of 4. Quite straightforward when we have a single term in a bracket which is being raised to a power. But now, in grade 9, we start to find things a little bit different. So this would give us 16x to the power of 4 as our final answer. Alright, so now moving to grade 9 mathematics, all of a sudden we find that we have two terms inside our bracket which is being squared. So what I generally find my students doing is that they'll go, alright, well I know that I need to then square both of these terms. So they end up going 16x squared plus 9. Now, is this correct? Well, we're going to find out now exactly what is the right answer. So when we have two terms inside of a bracket, this means this bracket multiplied by itself. Now, according to the rules, we have to use FOIL. So we need to multiply the first term by the first term in my second bracket, the first term by the last term in the second bracket, and then we'll repeat for the second term in my first bracket. So if we do this together, we got 4x multiplied by 4x, which gives me 16x squared. I then got 4x multiplied by negative 3, which gives me a negative 12x. Again, we follow the same rules. Negative 3 times 4x is negative 12x. And lastly, negative 3 times negative 3 gives me a positive 9. Now, let's go back to our basics. We have minus and plus signs. When we are minusing and adding with variables, we can only do it if our variables are identical. So we have an x squared term. Do we have any other x squared terms? No, we don't. So we bring this down, and we've got 16x squared. Now, we notice that our two middle terms, negative 12x and negative 12x, that will be simplified to negative 24x. Because our variables are the same, we can then add them. And lastly, we add our 9, and that is our answer. Is this answer completely different to the one we thought the answer was? Of course it is. So this is showing us that the rules do not apply if I have two terms in my bracket. Okay, so let's start with another example. We've got negative 10x minus 4 squared. So, based on what we did previously, we stated that because I have a bracket with two terms inside of it, which is being squared, I should just repeat this bracket and then multiply out. So again, we're going to go first by the first, first by the last, second by the first, and second by the last. Again, negative 10 times negative 10, two negatives are going to give me a positive, so it'll be a positive 100. X times x is x squared. Then negative 10x times a negative 4. Again, I have a negative times a negative, so it'll be a positive. That's always good to get that out the way first. 10 times 4 is going to give me 40 with the x, positive 40x. Again, I repeat, so negative 4 times negative 10x, it's going to give me a positive again with another 40, and there's an x, so positive 40x. And lastly, my two constants multiplied together, a negative and a negative is going to give me positive, and 4 times 4 is 16. I then need to collect my like terms. So 100x squared plus 80x plus 16 is my final answer. Now, in mathematics, simplifying and solving for x are generally made up in our question 1 in paper 1. So this sort of stuff is generally the easier stuff in the maths paper and should take you a very short amount of time. So when we talk about a short amount of time, this seems like a very long way to work it out. So is there another way? Of course there is. So let's investigate. This is going to be the same sum, alright, just using an easier way. So we've got the same sum, negative 10x minus 4 squared. So what we've realized is that when we have two terms in a bracket being squared, we generate three terms as our answer. So let's use what we previously thought was correct and then find a way to get that middle term. So we notice that in our final answer, we are actually in fact squaring the first, because negative 10x squared does give me 100x squared, which is over here. And the negative 4 squared, which means negative 4 times negative 4, does produce a positive 16. But this over here is where we get confused. How do we find that positive 80x? Well, I'm going to teach you a shortcut. So what I want you to do is I want you to square the first. So that gives us 100x squared. Then what I want you to do is I want you to square the last and leave some space in the middle here for our middle term. So negative 4 squared gives me a positive 16. So how in fact are we going to be able to generate that middle term? Well, what I want you to do is I want you to say, what is my first term multiplied by my last term? So that is negative 10x multiplied by a negative 4. Now because we're growing up, we know that in algebra we don't like to use multiplication signs. So in fact it's negative 10x in a bracket, bracket negative 4, which does of course mean multiplication. Either way is fine. So once we've done that, what do we generate? Well, we generate a positive, because a negative times a negative gives me that positive 40x. Is this the same as positive 80x? No, it isn't. So how do we get there? Well, we simply have to take our answer after multiplying these terms together and doubling it. Now, doubling it is simply just multiplying something by 2. So 2 times 40x is going to simply give me 80x. Now that I've found my middle term, it's positive, I fill it in, and there's my answer. So once we start becoming a lot more confident, this would be option number 1. If we battle with algebra, don't be shy to use option 2. It will take you slightly longer, but it will also eliminate any silly mistakes. Alright, so that might have seemed a little bit confusing to you. So let's do 2 more examples together, just to prove to you that it does actually work. So let's make up 2 terms. So we've got, say for instance, 9p to the power of 4 minus x to the power of 3 squared. So what do we need to do? Well, we said, first of all, we need to square our first term. So what is that going to give us? Well, 9 squared is 81. And based on those rules from earlier, we learned that when we've got a power raised to another power, we use multiplication. So this is going to be p to the power of 4 times 2, so it'll be p to the power of 8. That's our first term. Now, let's leave some space for our middle term that we're going to find out afterwards. And let's square our second term. Now we must remember, this is very, very important, that often we just sort of put in a minus sign. But if we've got negative x cubed squared, it means negative x cubed times negative x cubed. Now one thing that I like to point out is, before we get to the multiplication of our variables, let's first deal with the signs in front. Now, based on the rules back that we learned when we were doing integers, a negative multiplied by a negative is going to give us a positive. So let's first work on that. So we know that our answer is going to be positive. X cubed squared will land us with x to the power of 6, because 3 times 2 is 6. Now, the tricky part. How do we find the middle term? Let's use the shortcut. So we've got 9p to the power of 4 in a bracket, open another bracket, multiplied by negative x cubed. Again, don't be confused if you'd rather like to use 9p to the power of 4 times the negative x cubed. So, what did I say is a very good way to do this? Let's look at the signs. So if there's no sign in front of a 9, it means it's a positive number. So a positive multiplied by a negative, back again to those rules, we know that a negative times a positive gives us a negative. So coming back, we've got positive 9 times a negative x. What does that give us? A negative 9. Multiplying 2 variables together that are different, we can do that, we just won't add the exponents. So the answer will be negative 9, p to the power of 4, x to the power of 3. Right, is that our final answer? No, as we discovered, we still need to multiply this by 2. We need to double it. So what do we get? Well, does 2 carry any variable? No, it doesn't. So we simply need to multiply this 2 by my coefficient. So 2 multiplied by a negative 9, positive times a negative, gives me that negative 18 p to the power of 4 x cubed. So now that we've found our answer, we can slap it into the middle. We've got a negative 18 p to the power of 4 x cubed. Alright, time for our second example. Now, we haven't yet used any fractions. So what I notice with my students, if I have 4p to the power of 2, so 4p squared, minus a quarter all squared, the students start seeming that we can't really do this because now we've got a fraction. I don't know how to square a fraction. Well, all you need to simply do is if I have a fraction that's being squared, what does it mean? Well, it means that I have a negative quarter multiplied by another negative quarter. Again, I said to you that when we're dealing with negatives and positives, let's first deal with the signs. So a negative times a negative gives me the positive. Now I don't need to worry about the negatives anymore. So now I've simply got a quarter multiplied by another quarter. Now this is grade 7 maths. When I'm multiplying fractions, I need to multiply my numerators and I need to multiply my denominators. So 1 times 1 gives me 1 and 4 times 4 gives me 16. So if I had a quarter being squared, what are the rules? I need to square my numerator and then I need to square my denominator. So 1 squared means 1 times 1, which is 1, and 4 squared means 4 times 4, which is 16. So don't overcomplicate it, just stick to the rules. Mathematics is always testing you on your application. They're going to throw things at you that seem different, but in fact all they're doing is they're trying to see if you can stick to the rules. So let's approach this one. I have 4p squared minus a quarter all squared. Again, I have 2 terms. So we know that we need to now write this out with 2 separate brackets. So I've got 4p squared minus a quarter and 4p squared minus a quarter. So let's do it the old school way and then we'll move to the way of the shortcut just to show you that it still works when we're dealing with fractions. So first term by the first term, so 4 times 4 is 16, the p squared times p squared gives me p to the power of 4. Again, we need to multiply the first by the last. So what is 4 multiplied by a quarter? Now again, multiplying a whole number by a fraction seems to be a bit of a challenge for us. But let's go back to some simple rules. I have 4 multiplied by a quarter. Can I do this? Of course I can do this because I'm saying what are 4 quarters going to give me? So if we thought about it logically, if I had 4 quarters, what would that give me? Well, a quarter plus a quarter is a half, 2 quarters, plus another quarter gives me 3 quarters, plus another quarter will give me 4 quarters. So this is the answer I'm going to get to, and we know that 4 over 4 is represented as 1. But now how do I get to that by working it out? So if I wanted to put this onto paper, I have a whole number multiplied by a fraction. So how can I actually do this? Well, my tip is to say 4 over 1. I've now taken a whole number and turned it into a fraction, just to make it easier for the operation. So any number can be written as a fraction, any whole number can be written as a fraction if I simply put it over 1. It's not changing the value of this 4 because 4 divided by 1 is 4. Now, multiplication of fractions, as we saw earlier, I need to do numerator by numerator, denominator by denominator. If you know how to cross cancel, go ahead and do that. I know you will know how to do it, but I'm going to do it the old school way. So 4 times 1 is 4, 1 times 4 is 4. Now 4 over 4, as we know, is 1 whole. So now we can see how we managed to get to that answer by putting it onto paper. So what would be the trick here? If you're a little bit more advanced, if I've got 4 times a quarter, we know that we're simply taking our whole number and multiplying it by the numerator. So if we have 4 times a quarter, we can simply say that this is going to be 4 times 1 and I'll be left with 4 over 4. It gets more complicated when we start dealing with variables. So if I had 4x times a quarter, again, don't be confused because I said that we take the whole number and we multiply it by the numerator and I'll be left with 4x over 4. Let's come back to the sum. So I've got 16p to the power of 4, which we worked out from 4p squared times 4p squared. I've now got 4 multiplied by a negative quarter. So it's 4p squared multiplied by a negative quarter. My answer is going to be a negative. Now, we've got 4p squared multiplied by a quarter. I said to you, this is a whole number. So let's simply multiply this by my numerator, which gives me the 4p squared, and my denominator stays the same. Again, we're going to go negative quarter times 4p squared. If you haven't noticed, this is exactly the same operation we did just before. So again, I'm going to have a negative, because a negative times a positive is a negative, and then 4p multiplied by my numerator gives me 4p squared over 4. And lastly, a negative quarter times a negative quarter, as we saw earlier, is going to give me a positive 1 over 16. Now we need to collect. Well, can I collect? So I've got 16p to the power of 4 and a positive 1 over 16. Now, we're dealing with fractions. We are dealing with minus signs. Again, going back to those basics from grade 7, when we're doing either addition or subtraction with fractions, we can only perform those tasks if my denominator is the same. Is my denominator the same? Of course it is. So we know that our answer is going to be a negative, because I've got a negative and a negative, and we're only adding, so it will remain negative, and my denominator will stay the same. But now what is negative 4p squared minus another 4p squared? Well, it's going to give me negative 8p squared. And that is my final answer. Right, so I'm going to leave this example on the board as we do the other way of solving for two terms in a bracket, which is being squared, just so you can see how it links up. So again, I'm going to repeat this sum. I'm going to have 4p squared minus a quarter all squared. Now, we said that the shortcut would take us to saying, what is my first term squared? Well, let's first square the coefficient, which gives me 16, and then p squared to the power of 2 is going to be 2 times 2, so p to the power of 4. Now we go to our second term, and it's a negative quarter being squared. A negative times a negative is going to give me that positive, which is 1 over 16. I'm not going to explain that again, as it was explained earlier on. Now, it's that magic middle term. How are we going to find that middle term? Well, we said the step was, step 1, we need to multiply the first term with the second term. That is step 1. Multiply the first term with the second term in my bracket. So what is 4p squared times a negative quarter? Well, it's going to give me a positive times a negative, which gives me that negative. Now what is 4 times a quarter? Well, we learned that earlier. We said that if we have a whole number multiplied by a fraction, we simply say the whole number multiplied by the numerator, which gives me that 4 over 4. So, now, what happens to the p squared? Well, it simply tags along. So now I've got a negative 4 over 4 p squared. How am I going to do this now? Well, I've now got this, which needs to be multiplied by 2. So if you just pause this video right now, you're going to notice that, well, how am I going to get to this 8p squared over 4? So now all of a sudden I've got 2 multiplied by a negative 4 over 4. So what did we say when we got a whole number multiplied by a fraction? I simply take this 2 and multiply it by the numerator. So I've got 2 times a negative 4, which gives me a negative 8 over 4 p squared. For those of you who are really looking at this really hard, you notice that I can actually simplify this. Alright? I didn't want to touch on that just yet because it might just throw a few people off. So 8p squared divided by a 4 means that 4 goes into itself once and it goes into here twice. So my final answer on this side would be 16p to the power of 4 minus 2p squared plus 1 over 16. And the same can be said for over here. Now that I've found my middle term, I slot it in and then I simplify. So my final answer again will be 16p to the power of 4 minus 2p squared plus 1 over 16. So we notice how they are exactly the same answers. One is the shortcut, One is the long way. It does not make a big difference which way you do it, but rather do the one you feel comfortable with. Okay, so I'd like you to do the following two examples on your own. I'm going to put them on the board now as number 1 and number 2. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to look at these, jot them down on a piece of paper, try and solve them. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to do that, and then we'll get back and solve them together. So the first one will be 3b squared minus 4 all squared, and the second one we'll try and include a fraction just to test those skills, which would be a third x squared minus 2 all squared. Alright, so you've tried to solve these. I hope you were correct, but let's just do this together using the shortcut method. So I need to square my first term, which would have given you 9b to the power of 4, and I would have squared my second term, which would have given me a positive 16. Then how do I find the middle term? Well, what is 3b squared multiplied by a negative 4? My answer is going to be a negative. 3 times 4 is going to give me 12. So let's just do this on the side. We're going to have a negative 12, right, b squared. Now, that's not my final answer for the middle term. I still need to multiply it by 2. So a positive times a negative gives me that negative. 2 times 12 is 24 b squared. So the middle term is going to be negative 24 b squared. Let's make it a bit clearer for you. B squared. And that's solved. Let's do the same for the other side. Again, we need to find what my first term is squared. So we said with fractions, we need to just square the top, square the bottom. So 1 squared is 1, 3 squared is 9, and then x squared is 2 times 2, power raised to another power. So my answer will be 1 over 9, x to the power of 4. Now I need to square the negative 2. Negative 2 times itself, which is negative 2 times negative 2, is going to give me a positive 4. Right, how do I find the middle term? Multiply the two terms together. Now, again, we're back to that skill of multiplying a fraction by a whole number. We said, first things first, let's first get the positive and negative out the way. A positive times a negative gives me that negative answer. 2 times a third, I take my whole number, I multiply it by my numerator, so I get a negative 2 over 3 x squared. Is this my final answer? No, I still need to double that. So I put it into a bracket, and I multiply it by 2. Now again, we're going back to that skill of multiplying a whole number by a fraction. My answer is going to be a negative, get that out the way. 2 times 2 is 4 over 3 x squared. I've now found my middle term, so your answer should be 1 over 9 x to the power of 4 minus 4 over 3 x squared plus 4.